Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Thank you very much for being here with us tonight. We are very privileged to have Dr. Tony Allan with us, and he is the World Authority on Food, Water, and Water Security in the Middle East. Professor Allan is a distinguished scholar and heads the London Water Research Group at King's College London and the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS. He specializes in the analysis of water resources in semi-arid regions and on the role of global systems in ameliorating local and regional water deficits. Professor Allan's attention has evolved over his career from concern with hydrological and environmental issues to the social and political ones when it became evident that environmental science could not explain why people manage water the way they do. Professor Allan has contributed to the discourse by noting that water-short economies achieve water and food security not on the basis of their own water endowments, but by importing water-intensive food commodities and by identifying the concept of virtual water. He is the author of central texts in the field including the Middle East water question, hydropolitics and the global economy, and virtual water, tackling the threat to the planet's most precious resource. Professor Allan provides advice to governments and agencies, especially in the Middle East, on water policy and water policy reform. In recognition of his contributions, Professor Allan has received international awards, including the 2008 Stockholm Water Prize, the 2013 International Environmentalist Award, and the Prince Albert of Monaco Water Prize. Professor Allan joined us under the University Research Board Visiting Scholar Program through a joint invitation of our Food Security Program and the Department of Landscape Design and Ecosystem Management. FAFS, the school, would like to recognize the AUB University Research Board for its generous support in bringing Professor Allan to Lebanon. FAFS, the Faculty of Agriculture and Food Sciences, is honored to welcome Professor Allan, who is an expert in water use and food scarcity, particularly in light of the importance of food security in the Middle East and North Africa. Faculty members, staff, and students across this faculty are researching and publishing on the multiple dimensions of food security, considering both the production and the consumption side approaches of the problem. I am pleased to invite Professor Allan to the floor.
Thank you, Professor Allan. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm honored that so many people can spare some time to hear me. The news I bring is that this activity, food security and nutrition, and a wide spectrum of elements of the food supply chain that we all know we like to weave together, it is evident that, or becoming evident across the world, that Beirut AUB is becoming a center of this science. So congratulations on putting together the group you have. And
Keep doing what you're trying to do.
okay. Could you hear me? Good. Yeah. I was explaining that the world is becoming aware of the activities here and what you are achieving. And today I've had wonderful conversations with, on the technical side, on the subject of conservation agriculture, also on the finer points of Earth observation and what can be achieved in detecting ET, and other conversations in the past 48 hours on the politics of water. I'm very impressed indeed that the awareness of politics is so deep here, and the theme of what I'm going to talk about is why, unfortunately, because water security is so important, it is in the interest of those that govern to have people believe that they are water and food secure. And so great efforts go into making sure that people feel comfortable about the predicament they're in, although they, to the point that they don't even feel that they're in a predicament, because if it was to be the case that food was not in the shops, there would be people on the street, and to even imagine that is so important that the issue of food security is way in the background. I hope that that will be more clear in about 30 minutes from now when I conclude. So, food water security in the Middle East, I'm privileged to have spent much of my career trying to understand water in the Middle East. I realized when I started to do that in the 1960s that I was working in a region where, as an outsider, or even as an informed scientific insider, it was obvious that there was not as much water as would make everyone happy. But as the decades went by, I discovered that, in fact, there was a system in place that helped people exist and feel comfortable with the situation. So what I was wanting to show, and what questions I'm going to try and answer, where the water to underpin the Middle East's rising food demand comes from. There are two contradictory narratives on water and food security. The true one, that is scientifically true, is a destabilizing narrative which has to be backgrounded. And I've been talking about the Allan narrative, which is the one that everyone lives with. So in some of the questions I'm going to try and answer are, what have the trends in demand for food been in the MENA region, as well as in the world, and how has the MENA region's water resource deficit been addressed? What version of food and water security can the MENA economies enjoy in future? And is food and water security and practice too difficult for a collective understanding? We do the best we can with what knowledge we have. And why will truisms that are not true prevail and the critical known continue to be constructed as an unknown? So underlying fundamentals. Scientists are concerned with underlying fundamentals. They write for each other. They don't write for politicians. They write to help people that come to study this and to understand things. And I have been involved in a transition from just thinking about the water in the river and water in the ground to looking at a bigger perspective, or a bigger, more comprehensive perspective on water. That we have blue water, which is the water that's in the ground, in a river, which you can pump, and many people need and compete to use. People in the cities, people in industry, people at home, all need water that you can pump and move around. But then that water can also be used on the farms, and in fact, more of that water is used in producing food than in doing anything else. 70% of that blue water is in fact used to produce food. The majority of water is beyond that, and that's what we call green water, the water in the solid profile, which is the majority of water in the production of food. 70% is green water. And then I observed that you can move water, as it were, virtually around the world, and we call that virtual water. I was very happy that without massive research funds, one identified something which other people hadn't noticed. And it took about 10 years, which is quite a short time for the science community to adapt or to adopt that idea. And it took at least 25 years, as I predicted, for there to be a much more general awareness of the importance of being able in trade to move, as it were, all the inputs that had been put into food or other things, but certainly to food around the world. So with the other issues, water consumption in domestic industry and agriculture, the point I would like to get across is that we are all aware, as users of water at home, that we do need the blue water which can be pumped and moved around in a volume that is sufficient for us to keep well and clean. And that's a very small amount of water. In a European country is about 150 litres per day. I presume it's somewhat close to that in Lebanon. But in many countries, people get by on less than 100, perhaps only 40 litres per day, which is, cubic metre is about this much, and so 160 litres per day is quite a small amount of water compared with the water in our food. Water in our food is, this is about 2.5 cubic kilometres, 2.5 cubic metres, and if you're a vegetarian, that's enough, but if you eat a lot of beef, it's twice as much. So, this little amount of water for our domestic use, this huge amount of water which no one thinks about in the food production. And having identified virtual water as an idea which gets people to understand why, in fact, they are secure, I then, in the past 5 or 6 years, have been aware that if all of this water is being used to produce our food, then the profession which we really need to care about is the farmer and the irrigator, because they, in fact, manage this water. There are some engineers and some regulations which might be in place, but ultimately the decision whether to use conservation agriculture as a way of managing, which is very good for water management of the soil or not, is decided by farmers. If you are wanting to irrigate and divert water, and how much water you use, whether you overuse it because no one's charging for it, then the farmer is the agent that does that. So we as consumers of food and needers of food security need, in fact, to care about farmers, to care for them so that they have a livelihood, so that they can continue to produce food, so that they have production services. But they also have stewardship services, for which they are, at the moment, rarely paid for, and yet, intelligently, people in the science movement, people should pay for it. We should include in the price of food the costs of making sure that the children of our children will have water in the future. We need to get farmers to use the water more carefully. So we've managed water consumption in the food supply chain is another idea. So in the recent past, what I found was that having conceptualized the world and the endowments in different countries, and the fact that about 10 countries keep the world water secure, I'll show those in detail later on. Having observed that, now the idea that we want to put in place is that if you are a water sector person, which I am, but I've now recognized that the food supply chain, from production to processing, trading, retailing, and consuming, is a food supply chain in which water at the beginning is very important, and therefore we need to understand the food supply chain, because what people consume, as I say, if you're a vegetarian, you just need this much. If you're a big beef eater, you need twice as much. What people decide to consume is extremely important. So this food supply chain idea is in place, and I'm very pleased to observe that it is part of the thinking of the centre here. And I'll also briefly, towards the end, talk about global political economy of the food system. So, we're going to take those things in turn. What are the underlying fundamentals on the hydrological side? Well, blue and green water, I'm sorry this is from Kenya, but I don't have a diagram, although there's someone in the room who will be able to produce one, and if I'm sure I press them to, so that I can have a better program. But you can see how we have the rainfall coming in, but it is then segmented, as the hydrogeologists say, into different uses. And in Kenya, which is similar to many parts of the Middle East, the vast majority of water is green water transpired from the vegetation and from the cropland. And there's a sense on that the vast majority of water in play is green water rather than blue water. I've hinted at this, the water consumption in domestic use, industry and agriculture. These numbers are contentious, and we would like to have better numbers that are well researched, but this gives you an idea that we've talked about green water. You can see on that picture, on this slide, that we're suggesting that about 62% of the water is in the rain-fed farming, irrigated farming about 26%, and in food processing, which is also part of the food supply chain, there's some blue water there. And then there's the small amount of water which we care about deeply, because we keep clean with it at home, and we drink good quality water in the tap, we hope. We get our jobs, but that is only about 8%. So we've got awareness of the water, blue water, which we need at home and in our jobs, and a lack of awareness of the vast majority of water which farmers are managing in the food supply chain. Sorry. And you can see at the bottom, to try and emphasize that, we've got food water. Food water is a good concept. It's the water that's needed to produce food, and the non-food water which we need at home and in our industry. And you can see the vast majority of water is in the food supply chain. So please go away with that message that you need to care about farmers, because they're keeping us safe and well in some form of water security. And this is a slide which gives you an idea of how much water is used in the different uses. At the bottom, agriculture in blue, industry in another sort of blue, and domestic in green. And you can see the MENA region is illustrated up at the top there. And you can see the MENA region is similar to the world's position, and the vast majority of water is in fact in the food supply chain. Now, virtual water trade, just to indicate you, the top slide indicates where the cropping is done. Big stuff in India and China, and across Europe, and across Russia and the growing lands of Ukraine and so on. There are a lot of production in the United States, which is something that's been around for 100 years, 150 years, when the Europeans started to settle that part. Quite a bit of water being used at the moment in South America, and thank goodness for South America. It is a continent with a vast amount of water, which has not all been utilized yet, and so to some extent we can rely on South America to give us the food trade, the trade in food, which is going to keep the world in some sort of security. The volume of water, or the volume of food that is traded, is not all that great. It's about 15% of the food produced is traded. Now that's a very important trade, because it keeps the world at peace. If we didn't have that trade, we would go to war, because nations would not have enough food and water to keep themselves secure. They would have to go to war. So if we have peace, we can have trade. If we don't have peace, we can't have trade. So peace and trade are so important to us, we should watch it very carefully. And perhaps we'll notice as I go on that the position is that politicians assume that trade is going to be able to continue. If it didn't, we would find, just to give you a sense of whether to whom it matters, but there are 28 countries in Europe, and 3 of them are massive food importers, including the UK, but Germany and Italy are massive food importers. China has become a significant importer, Japan, Korea, massive food importers. But if you look at the whole range of countries in the world, there are about 210, some are very tiny, but at least 160 are net food importers. So being a net food importer is not unusual. In fact, it's extremely normal. Lebanon's a net food importer, every country in the Middle East. So there are 28 countries in Europe and 22 in the Middle East. That's 50. That's a quarter of the countries in the world are really very significant net water or net food importers. And fortunately, so far, the world has been the exporters of food, which you can see at the bottom of countries such as the United States or the Americas are very important sources of food for the rest of the world. And another slide I show that Canada, United States, Brazil with Argentina are extraordinarily important to the rest of the world now and will be in future. Africa is an interesting challenge in that Africa at the moment has about 1.5 billion people. But by the end of the century, when I'm gone and you're probably gone, it will have perhaps 4.3 billion people. And Asia will only have 4.1. So watching Africa is a very important thing to do, because if you think about the demography and the underlying and fundamental of demography, it's extremely important in that every new citizen of the world needs, if they're a vegetarian less than in India, then they only need this much water, but if they're going to be living in a place where they eat a lot of beef, they will in fact have twice as much, or at least 50% as much as this. So we, fortunately India, although it's very a significant country with a rising population, fortunately it's mainly vegetarian. So these are social things that wouldn't figure in an engineering course, but certainly figure in the sort of program you have here in Beirut, taking the bigger picture into account. The Chinese story of demography is fascinating in that, relatively recently, in 1979, the population was about 800 million. It's now around about 1.4, so it's gone up quite a lot. But the important thing is it levels off. Then there are 300 people, perhaps 400 people not there, who will be on the world market competing for the food would be honoured. So the Chinese have helped the world without anyone caring too much about the social sacrifices they have made and the consequences of those. It could be, we don't know what the outcome, social outcome is going to be. But the other thing that's going to happen in the future, having done this remarkable thing in the past 30 years, is that by the end of the century there will be a reduction in population from 1.4 billion to 1 billion. So another 400 billion people not there. So, but at the same time as that is happening, Africa's population is rising very rapidly, and you can't not consider the global position, because it's in the global position that 150 countries out of 210 or 20 are in fact able to be water secure. So where there are places that the demand for food is globally beginning to fall, they're doing rather good things for places where the reduction in population has not yet taken place. So, then just to back up those numbers, you can see that for a country like Egypt, in 1970 it was where it was, and will be 120 million by the time it levels off. So you've got a lot of demand coming from this region. So you need to watch out for competing demand. Competing demand is going to come from Africa, and solutions are coming from China, in a sense, if you take this bigger perspective. The trends in green and blue and virtual water imports in cereals are shown here from about 1980 or so through to just 2010. You can see the imports. Well, these are the net imports and exports, and you can see the imports are going up steadily. And this is another way of looking at it, with 7 different regions or continents or parts of continents, and going across the bottom there, and you can see between 1986 and 2010, Europe has been doing interesting things, and MENA has also been doing interesting things in terms of demand but Europe has been putting in more demand than the MENA region. And we're talking about the MENA region and trying to put it into global context. So, water consumption and the food supply chain, and sorry, this is now the final, the fourth point of this. This slide is one that was drawn to my attention by Martin Kullert, who's in the room, and this is a fascinating slide. So many stories and tunes can be played on it, but you can see that the histograms go from 1965 for the left-hand part of each of the blocks, going through to 2010, and you can see how in North America, one of the food exporters, this is the global cereals trade, import shifts and exporting capacity of the major exporters. You can see that the United States has leveled off. It was important in 1965, but they got more and more important, and is now not going to be the source of additional supply, because we could argue, and I haven't got time to prove it this evening, that it's already pushed its natural resources further than it should. Imagine, there are some people from the United States here, I'm sure, bless you, you've been doing this wonderful service to the world. You've been exporting your environment, which was not all that sensible in a way. Thank you very much. Certainly my country has benefited from it. You've been exporting half-cost food, as you subsidize it as we do in Europe. Europe and the United States have been competing down the price of food, as I'll show in a moment. And it is now a point at which perhaps the United States and its farmers and government and USDA should stand back and decide whether it can afford to export its environment at the rate at which it has over the past century and a half, because the UK started to import in a big way in the middle of the 19th century from the United States. You can see that blessed South America is off, going upwards at a huge and important rate. So that's why there is evidence that the South Americans are also prepared to export their environment. We know that there is extra water there. I remember I was there just this time last year in Brazil, and I didn't get out into the Amazon basin and its tributaries of the Amazon, which go from south to north. But in just one of those sub-basins, there was more water in the soil profile, there's green water, than in the whole of the Middle East water resources. So just in one sub-basin of the Amazon, there's more water than in the whole Middle East, including the Nile, gold, all the other stuff that you have. Australia has played its part. That's not because it's rich in water, but because it's got very few people, and it has the capacity to mobilize and again export its environment. Eastern Europe is, in a way, like South America, an extraordinary story. I remember being studying the Middle East water in 1972, and being aware that because the Soviet Union at that stage, which had a strong alliance with Egypt over the previous 20 years, suddenly found itself unable to meet the food needs of Egypt, which had crossed from being just about self-sufficient and was starting to head off in a very high trajectory. And one of the reasons that the United States could come in was because Russia or the Soviet Union at that stage couldn't afford to buy American wheat with rubles to send to the Soviet Union. So Eastern Europe, however, and I never dreamed or hoped this could happen, but as a consequence of the change of way of doing things, new ways, new methods, new governance, new technology, or different technology, we can see that it's heading off in a very interesting direction. So that if you look at the league table of who's exporting food, we find that Ukraine and Russia are in the top 10, sometimes in the top 5, which again is reassuring, because the population of Russia is falling, or has fallen, perhaps it will start to rise again. And so there's resource there, which with better management looks as if it will help regions such as Europe and the Middle East to have a version of water security. Central America, Western Europe is interesting. You can see that it was importing, well, all these figures looked at another way indicate that it was importing 60% of its food in the 1940s and 50s, and then this starts in 1960, I think. And then, because of the investment and subsidy that was going into farming in Europe and Western Europe, it got to the point where it was only 40% dependent. And now, because of that particular regime of management was found to be wasteful, and there were lots of unpleasant milk lakes and meat mountains and so on, it was decided to change that, and so we've gone back to importing food, in that case helping ourselves, importing other people's environments. And you can see on the right-hand side we've got Asia and the Middle East and Africa. Unfortunately, this slide only puts Middle East and Africa together, but you can see that that is already a very significant part of the food demand of the world, and will continue to get bigger, and the news from Africa is particularly interesting. Another very important, many of those things will be known to some of you, but I think many of you will not have seen a review such as that. But many other things are unknown. If I asked how many people would say, have international food prices been falling or rising, falling or rising, sorry,
They're coupled with oil prices for about 100.
Yeah, so you're, okay. I show a diagram that we both know, yeah. But if I ask other people about it, as you say, you can ask one person and they tell you some news which is completely different from the rest. This is a good example. But in fact, they've been falling. Some would say for 1,000 years, certainly for 200, and definitely for the past 70. So that's comfortable for those of us that import food. It's great news for politicians who are in food importing countries. And will they continue to fall? Well, FAO numbers show this version with a spike in the 1970s, which those of you who were around at the time will remember. I remember that very, quite frightened about it, and thought that the world would, coming down the right-hand side of that spike of the 70s, I thought, we'll sensibly not go back down to where we were. We will somehow start to get prices to rise. But no, I talked to a friend in LSE, and he said, no, they'll come down, because he realised that the pressures around were there to keep the price going down. But it's partly technical, partly that there are technologies in agriculture which have made the process more efficient and have been cost reducing. But it's also because we haven't included the costs of damaging the environment, both the atmosphere, or including the atmosphere, biodiversity, and water. So you can see that we did have a bit of a rise in, just at the turn of the last century, there was a bit of a price increase in oil and energy, and commodity prices behave like a herd. As once the energy prices go up, other commodities go up. And of course, with the arrival of 2008 and the financial crisis, in addition to this energy issue, we've had that spike. But you can see the difference between the orange, which is the nominal price, which indicates that prices have been going up. If you look at the trends before this current spike, you can see the trend was downwards. And that is the better diagram. If anyone would like it, well, you can get this off the web if you wish, or if you would like me to, or I'll leave this behind. But I feel so comfortable with this because it's telling the story that I want to tell. And it's by good economists and scientists. And you can see how, you can see why I was more worried about the 1970s price spike than perhaps the one that we've just gone through, where we had very extraordinary level of oil energy price increases. And we can see we've got the one we're going through at the moment, and it's now, the prices in 2016 are back to 2008 levels. Economists looked at what was happening in 2008, 9, 10, and 11 and said that the new normal is this thing over here, that prices were going to be volatile forever and there would be a tendency for prices to rise. Well, just as my economist friend in the 1970s said that no, they'll keep going down because of political pressures and the absence of taking into account the real cost of producing food are still there, and therefore those pressures, I believe, will continue to bring down the price of food. And I was even happier with this diagram from some modelers in Purdue, which, taking into account the 1990 period up to 2050, and the red estimates for model future, you can see where they've got the present price spike, and they conclude that the tendency will be that even by 2010 and on to 2050, there will still be a tendency for prices to fall. We can discuss that. I'd like to bring that to people's attention, because they know that prices have gone up, the prices have gone up in the shops, but in fact, the real price, the constant price, has gone down. Now this is the part that, because I'm going to generalize, there will be people in the room who say, no, that isn't what I think, and there'll be some unhappiness expressed. But I'm going to suggest that there are two contradictory narratives for water and food security in the region. There's a socially and politically stabilizing narrative that is promoted and believed by Middle East legislators and by Middle East water and food consumers. So that's one which is constructed, just as important as the truth, but it's not the truth, but that's what people believe. What people believe determines what they choose to eat and what they choose to think. The unacceptable destabilizing narrative is based on sustainable hydrological and economic fundamentals, which we've been talking about, and has been backgrounded by political processes. Now, I'm sure that there's no politician wasting their time to come to this session because they're too busy, but they would know this. Politicians know that you've got to have as few problems as possible, and if there are problems which solve themselves, like virtual water solves the water and food security problem of the region and that trade, let's just enjoy it. We've got 10 other lined up priorities and problems that are terribly difficult, and if there's one that just isn't, we can pretend it's not there, even though it is, if there was any sign that there was food insecurity, it would move straight up to the top. But successfully, my argument is, it's somehow a deal done between citizens and governments that it's best to just deal with it this way by backgrounding the issue. Well, the comfortably stabilizing first narrative that backgrounds the destabilizing knowledge based on water resource endowments, which we as water scientists know are there and in the long run will prevail. So there's food on the shelves of our shops and supermarkets, and it is essential that this food be affordable for low-income families, affordable food for low-income families. So food insecurity is being kept at bay, so there must be, so the evidence of the situation with enough food around is that, it's not an immediate problem. It might be happening in the future, but it's not an immediate problem. So the national water resources that currently underpin essential domestic, industrial and irrigation water services are secure, limited, but secure. No water can possibly be shared, however, with neighbouring economies, nor can existing water resources be decreased by the actions of neighbours that increase their water consumption. So if you're a downstream state, you don't want the upstream states to be taking it, and if you're an upstream state, you don't like a country, in fact, in a country like Egypt as a downstream state insists that its entitlement is exactly what it's been doing for the last 2,000 years, and there's no entitlement upstream. So that's something which gets more prominence, and in fact, the other than other issues. So serious water conflict is a risk, but it is a future problem, not an immediate problem. So that's the first narrative. The second narrative, the known that must be unknown. The economies of the Middle East overall are about 50% dependent on imported food. Some are over 90% dependent. Food security and water security depend on the availability of food from water surplus economies. We've seen that, the numbers for that. Meaner economies benefit from the global food system in two ways. First, they avoid the environmental costs and the political stress associated with the overuse of their own scarce water, because they're already doing that, but if they were asked to do more, it would really be a big political and stressful moment. And secondly, they've been benefiting from the long-term downward trend in global food commodity prices. There is no prospect of access to significant volumes of new, low-cost access to new, expensive water by desalination and so on. There's no significant volume of low-cost water going to be available to meet the needs of a doubled population, so there's definitely more demand for water to grow food. And Middle Eastern economies have, this is the part that I'm disappointed about. The meaner economies have diversified sufficiently to meet the costs of the rising levels of underpriced food imports. If they hadn't, there would be real trouble with all the economies of the region. But the fact that economic diversification is the way it's done, rather than by building a dam or doing something technological, is something which communities don't seem to be happy with, and politicians don't seem to be proud of. I mean, a country like Egypt, if it hadn't diversified as much as it had, would in fact be in a very terrible position, and one should rejoice that it's done that. It would have been better if it had been even more diversifying, but it has achieved a remarkable level of version of food and water security by having achieved that level of diversification. And future, as I say, we know what's going to happen in the future. Future water and food security needs just more economic diversification and expert engagement in the political economy of the global food commodity trade. And this I put together just as I was concluding, and I mentioned already today somewhere. Effective global food commodity trade enables water and food security. Effective trade is only possible in a world at peace. So if we had a world war, we would not be able to trade, and we would be in very, very serious trouble, because the population of the world since the last World War, that we say is a world war in the middle of the last century, the population is nearly trebled, so we've got a more demanding situation. But without food security, there can be no peace. So putting in place of diversified economies to ensure that we have a version of food security is very, very important, even if it is the invisible process which is not comfortable for governments to bring forward or to have citizens discussing. So, the knowns that should be foregrounded, if you're one of these people that thinks there should be a rational system. The limited capacity of the region to meet the food water needs of a double population. We should, in fact, be aware, I think I've given some of you a bit of a shock on the demographic side. Not everyone, just one or two will be thinking the same way. The global population dynamics and future patterns of global demands for food, and what I was saying about Africa, is certainly very important, because the Middle East was thinking in 2011, 12, 13 that what the solution was going to be investment in Africa. Well, Africa is going to need every drop of water and every ton of food, and Africa is a net food importing continent now, and I always thought that the sufficient water for another billion people, that it would have surplus water and be able to feed a billion people outside Africa, but no, the way we are thinking at the moment, at least the way I'm thinking, is that Africa will be a food importing continent at the end of the century. And that's an important thing to conjure. And then, as I said, and I've said enough, that we need to get people to recognise well, we don't have to get them to do it, because they live in the political system they live in, but it would be quite good if they could recognise the extent to which economic diversification, strangely, is the solution to water and food insecurity. Thank you very much.
Right. Hello, my name is Martin Koilitz. My name Anyway, I'm the one who's going to chair the session, and if you have any questions, please raise your hand, and I shall come with my microphone, but it doesn't really work, though. You can stand up and speak loudly. So, do we have any questions? Please, the gentleman.
Yeah, just thanks for your very good presentation. What about the climate change? What your projections based on maybe data on the food importation stuff, not only climate change, the impact on the agricultural sector.
Yeah, on climate change, I am not an expert, and I defer to those who are. The numbers I've been talking about in demography, what the region has coped with is, is in one part of the region, the population increased not just 2 times, but 10 times. And it's water secure and food secure. So adaptation is a wonderful thing, and the immediate pressures coming from demographic change and increased demand for food is, for the moment, much more serious than climate change. However, I can see that climate change does seem to be going to have a negative effect on this part of the world. There aren't many parts of the world where that can be said with certainty, because the temperatures can be said with certainty, but rainfall, damn it, the models don't work. And so I'm, as a water scientist, I'm very unhappy with the climate scientists when they're speaking with confidence about temperature and what's going to happen, sea levels and all the other things, and increased ET and whatnot, and so on. They're fine, but if you ask them, please, can you give us a model of what's going to happen in rainfall? And that's quite important for the Middle East, because every big river basin, let's say the Nile, the one that's relevant to this region, 3 models say there's going to be less rainfall, and 2 models say there's going to be more rainfall. Damn it, you can't go to any politician with that. It's hopeless. So climate change, yes, temperature is interesting, and we can know about that, but we don't have enough information to say anything certain about rainfall, certainly in a river basin such as the Nile. But I used to think it was just the Nile which was like this, but when I talk to climate scientists, they say, no, it's every major river basin in the world has got this problem. So, climate change, yes, it's important. There's evidence in this region, in this country, that rainfall is falling and has been for the past decades. So it would be wise to do as many precautionary things as possible. But that's just one other negative element of the future. The first one is that population rising, and we do need more water, and it's likely to be less. So the challenge for regions such as the Middle East are going to be even greater than other parts of the world. But if you think about a country such as, or little country such as Singapore, I'm not saying that Singapore is an example for the world, but on water, it's amazing. It has only 5% of the water it needs so that means it's got only barely enough water for the domestic and industrial water. And it doesn't have any water for food production in a negligible amount, so it imports all its food. And it is dependent on Malaysia for some water coming across the causeway, and when Malaysia challenged and said, well, you're going to have to pay more for that water, Singapore just said, hang on, we can desalinate for less. So technology has moved on. So a country can have only 5% of the water that it needs and be an advanced OECD economy. So being deterministic about whether the water endowment is good or not is not a good place to start. The place to start is the capacity of the economy to diversify and create jobs, such as all you hope to have in a nice, clean, risk-free world, relatively risk-free world, compared with the farmers who have a risky world handling the water.
We have
Okay. I have two questions for you. One is, in 2008, prices of cereals have gone up tremendously, between 40 and 50%. How do you explain that with the conditions you're talking about? The second question is about agricultural subsidies in both Europe and the United States. What happens if this does not continue to be the case in the food supply to the other nations which need it?
Yeah, the first question about food prices rising, they did rise. Rice particularly, but rice is not important because not very much of it is traded, but other cereals did go up by 60 or more percent, even 100% in some cases for a short time. So that was a response to much uncertainty in the world. It was partly the energy prices going up, and as I said, there's a sort of crowd thing happens, everyone joins in, worrying about prices, and agricultural commodity prices go up as well. And they tend to fall when energy prices have fallen, so the prices of commodities have come down again. So food prices do go up and down, but they tend to go up and down in particular periods when the economic global conditions are pushing things in that direction. The long-term trend is for prices to go down, even if we find that they should go up. Subsidies, one needs to understand subsidies. The European Union, farmers in the UK get about 30% of the cost of running a farm. They are supplemented. Part of the income of the farm is 30% approximately from the EU. Obviously the countries pay into that and they get this money back. In the United States, the subsidies have been falling, but they're a bit complicated in the United States. In the Farm Bill, which is something which is passed every 10 years, the last one, which was put in place in 2014, after 3 or 4 years of intense debate in Congress, because Republicans don't want to have food subsidies and so on, so they're trying always to bring them down. But part of the American system of dealing with poverty and poor people with the need for affordable food is to pay food stamps. So the 100 billion a year, which for a decade is where we are at the moment with the Farm Bill, 76 billion. 76 billion. It's, I don't know what the GDP of Lebanon is, but 76 billion would make a pretty big dent in that. So probably 50 or 100 countries in the world have GDPs less than the 76 billion, going to 43 billion Americans. So 14% of the American population is considered to be entitled to affordable food or free food. So subsidies are interesting. They can happen on the farm, or they can happen at the other end. The only part of the food supply chain which doesn't have subsidies is the middle, where we've got trade, processing, manufacturing, and retailing. That is a market which you would regard as either an effective market or a perfect market. It's got accounting rules, everything is counted. There's about between perhaps 1 and 2% of water used in that part of the food supply chain, because all the water is used in producing food. And the corporates and the others saying, wow, we're doing wonderful things. For every cubic meter we take out, we put another cubic meter back. So we get lots of kudos for that. But they're dancing on the pin in terms of the significance of that activity. But they're very good at persuading people we're doing the right thing. Whereas what they should be doing in a perfect world is having contracts with farmers, which allow farmers to have both the capacity to produce but also steward. So I've come to the conclusion at this point of trying to think about this with other people for the last couple of years, that I would like there to be a system which captures the value of water inputs and internalises the cost of damaging the water ecosystem. So the food should be more expensive at the farm gate. But there's so many political pressures that make people comfortable with low-cost food, affordable food, and when it goes to the other end, there are other ways of making food affordable. It would be good to have no subsidies and a market which makes everything, all the cost captured, but in the real world, where we have as some economists learned in the 1950s, there is a first best ideal economic system where everything is costed and counted, and then there's a second and third best system, which is what we actually live in. And the second and third best system is the result of there being moments in history where something's got to be fixed, and the way to fix that is with a government intervention. And so we may not like our subsidies, but we have a path-dependent position. This is where they are, and this is undoing them is so politically stressful that we tend to stay with them. And now, if people took my advice, I'd say, well, the only way to make sure that society can be kept safe by having farmers do things which manage biodiversity, farmers, water, farmers, and the atmosphere. 25% of the stuff is farm derived. We need, in fact, to help farmers do it well, because it's easier to persuade 500 million farmers to do that than to 7.25 billion people and consumers eat in a sensible way to make sure that we have a sustainable environment. So that's all about subsidies, which one has to be aware of if you're going to make any sense of the world.
Thank you, Dr. Allan, for the very interesting presentation. I come from a different field, but I have two questions for you. You were discussing the water scarcity and that water will go down. And in my thinking that if water will be scarce, the cost of food would be higher because there would not be enough water to produce food. My other question is about the farmers. As you have anticipated that food prices will go down, and in 2008 actually it drove farmers to produce more food because food became more expensive and more profit for the farmers. So it drove the agriculture sector positively when the food prices were a little bit higher for the rural communities and for agriculture. So there are two things that I cannot reconcile with, if you can explain or give me an answer.
Yeah, the experiment, not so much an experiment, just something that happened in 2008, was very important because it did reveal the shock which the system received from there being higher food prices. And not so much in Lebanon, but certainly in the Gulf countries, they all went off to Africa investing in land because they needed, in fact, it was investing in water. And so that moment, that rise in prices did cause people to think carefully about it. The higher prices, I agree, did encourage farmers to produce more. So economists in the room, if you give farmers higher prices, they produce more food. And that is very important because the food trade, international global trade, and the traders in food, watch that very carefully. What happens when food prices go up? Farmers produce more food. And the economists say, of course, that's what happens. So what we therefore did was to use additional resources to do that, or we mobilized them in ways that produce more food, but it had to be at the expense of the environment that was happening. And if we're not counting that cost, then we get into a position that we seem that people in the commodities trade would end up, there's space in there for us to produce more food. And those of us that say, hey, but the 5 or 10 places in the world where we have a desperate crisis in groundwater, California, Texas, Punjab, China, Australia, every country in the Middle East, and even in the UK, in the tiny place where we do some irrigation, that's where we run out of water. So wherever you irrigate, you always run out of water. At the moment, that's not for us a crisis, for me a crisis, is swamped by the evidence of, well, there seems to be enough space in there for, if you just put the prices up, things will be all right. Your second question was...
If there is less water, why would the prices also go down? That was the first question.
Yeah, well, that was, thank you for that. I didn't make it clear. That's my main message. Prices go down because the stability of governments and the existence of a government in power is absolutely essential that affordable food is made available to people, or to the poor people. The rich people don't have any problems, but poor people do, and poor people find too many get on the streets, it causes governments to fall. So this background fear, what I'm trying to show is that it's so important that it never gets discussed. The politicians have discovered that they can stay in power with the level of, with the measures that they put in place, including subsidies and other things, that they still allow there to be this tendency for prices to fall. It's not something that I like. As I said, I learned about it in the 1970s from an economist friend with LSE. The same political pressures are there. And although I'm not coming up with an original idea, we've now had another experiment. And this trends, like OECD diagram, which is all I like, you can see we are in a position, we couldn't have done that. No one, not a member of the food supply chain anywhere would have predicted that in 2010. Because I perhaps had the privilege of living through the early one, I said, well, I know it seems we're in a worse position, at least twice as many people in the world, so things haven't got any easier, but still the pressures to have affordable food are elemental political issues, and politicians just,
Hi, my name is Just do it? So, thank you for the presentation, and lots of interesting stuff in there. Yet I'm a little bit startled by what seems to me to be a contradiction, at least in the way you presented it. Because on the one hand, you suggested that we need to incentivize farmers, and on the other hand, you seem to advocate more trade. And it seems to me that what's actually the case is that at least part of the reason why farmers earn so little or get so little of the value that they actually produce is that international trade forces a kind of deflation of what they should get. So it's actually international trade that has put them in a position, I mean, at least in part, and there's obviously the local kind of value extraction mechanisms that are at play. But so international trade seems to be one of the more important factors in actually producing the situation where they cannot, because they're pushed to be more extractive, more soil mining, more water mining. And when that doesn't work, it's also what creates more poor people because they cannot do farming anymore. So there seems to me to be a fairly essential contradiction in these two positions, and I'd like to ask you to elaborate on that a little bit.
Yes, thank you for raising the point about the global prices. Although they please lots and lots of governments around the world because it means they can feed their own populations at a low cost of food. That's one of the reasons that Africa, especially, is in such a bad position, is that for the past 50 or 60 years, whenever there was a drought, food would be around the world on ships or in stores somewhere, and it would always be there'd be if things were normal, the price of food would rise in that economy. And they do rise, but as soon as they rise to an uncomfortable level for the governments to be safe in power, they could easily import half-cost food on the global system. So globalization, one of the huge casualties has been the poor farmer in places such as Africa, where it's a bit of a turn in Ethiopian circumstances now, but for decades the farmers got poorer and poorer because of this tendency for the government to import half-cost food.
So the contradiction remains, so trade can hardly be the answer if that's what's going to bring down food prices in the first place. Somehow one needs to move away from that trade so that people can actually earn or get the money that they're producing on the fields.
Yeah, but the reason that the Ethiopian and Tanzanian farmer can't get the extra price, I mean, there was a point just 2 years ago when, in the price spikes that had happened in the 2009, 10, 11 period, there was an investor who suddenly, I think it was $500 a ton or something. At that price, you know, they could make mistakes and still come through, and the local farmers who were producing in their traditional way were also able to get a good price. So everyone was happy. But then a Pakistani trader came to us and said, well, we can give you rice at half the cost. And suddenly people that were enjoying a decent living were investing and doing the things that we need them to do, or that Tanzania needed them to do. We found they couldn't because the prices collapsed. So I agree with you at the point, I should have emphasized it more, that this fall in food prices is very bad indeed for the small farmer in many, many countries as well.
Tony,
Someone with a microphone.
thank you so much. Always wonderful to see the bird's eye view and the challenging of received concepts. I feel privileged to have seen the birth of the virtual water concept about 20 years ago, and the extraordinary trajectory of this concept changing our whole view of water. And I wanted to press you on something of this sort of stratospheric conceptual dimension, which has to do with a very clear perception in economics that agriculture and the people who work in agriculture is actually an area of the economy that is increasingly marginal in comparison with industry, but much more with services. And that agriculture, unless it's industrialized and packaged and developed into a consumer market on a world level, is one where the economics of it is insufficient, unless agriculture is very seriously industrialized. It doesn't sustain itself economically as a concept. And in addition to that, we have the informatization of the industry, which makes even this level in the received tripartite distinction between agriculture, industry, and services, one that is increasingly tilting the world over towards 70–80% of value added produced worldwide, clearly in the services industry, with the consequence also on the livelihood of people. I mean, the United States is extraordinary in that sense, where you can see that over a period of 200 years, even though, as you say so well, the production of agriculture is worldwide, the people who live of it are now barely 1% of the American population. So my invitation is this: if there is a dimension which is at that level of intellectual caption that was at the origin of the virtual water concept, can you see in terms of the general economics trend worldwide that the concept of virtual water will not be sufficient in order to understand agriculture and water without a larger span of understanding that would include industry and much more difficult ways, the service industry that dominates the economy.
Thank you, Shubhi. Rami, you may have to come to my assistance in this.
Absolutely.
In that Rami is a farmer as well as a scientist, as well as a citizen of the world, and he has thought about these things. And whether we have agriculture which is smallholder and popular with farmers or in farmers markets and so on, there is a lot of discussion about that, the virtues of that sort of production. But we have, in fact, during this period when trade in food has kept the world in a version of security and therefore peace, we have that's been achievable because of the industrialization of farming, especially in the Americas, but also in Europe and other places, and in the Middle East as well. So, yes, I agree. We need to digest the idea of effective industrialized farming. The trouble is, we find that some of the practices of industrialized chemical farming, pesticides and herbicides and fertilizers, need to be re-examined as well. But I, especially talking to Ravi, I will ask him to comment after I finish, that the transition from a world in which an awful lot of farming is done in smallholder farms has been now done in much larger farms, has almost always been painful for the smallholder. But it has produced food with a certain amount of downside because of the chemicals in this modern system. But I think I agree with you that we will have to accept as global citizens, and some people within countries will also have to accept that the way we farm, partly because farming is a hard way of life, a high-risk way of life, and I've said it a number of times when I've been in Beirut, I've had a risk-free career with no worries at all. I once asked if I would like to retire when I was 45, and that was the biggest risk I had in my whole career. But if you're a farmer, you have three bigger risks than that every week. It's constant dealing with all the different things. Water, unfortunately, water is not as important as labour and other things to a farmer. So trying to get the message across. Your point about the dynamic of moving from smallholder to industrialised farming is something which needs to be understood. And I've twice met, 3 times now met Ravi, and he's very good on this particular topic.
Thank you very much, Tony. That's I mean, there is the unavoidable and there is the undesirable, and we need to try to bring things together in that sense. Let me just pose the same question that should be posed in a different way. In the Arab world, you have today perhaps 250 million people. About half of these are in rural areas, building their livelihood from some form of farming, of natural resource management that is related to farming. That's about 175 million people. If we accept this quote-unquote unavoidable, there is no alternative approach to all of that, which appears to be pretty logical, then within the next 20 years we're going to find ourselves with 150 million people who have nothing to do. This is not new. In Marxist terms, this was called the reserve army of labor. Unfortunately, in these countries here, there is no employment to create the labor, so they just remain a reserve army, which does what armies do, which is fight. And a lot of the conflicts that you can see are born in here, in that region, in this big agrarian transformation, from a world that's becoming, in which food production is being decreased because of obvious reasons, and clearly, pure economics, supply and demand, value, economics, value added, But the social implications of this are extremely destructive, more destructive than just increasing the price of commodities. So while there is a logic in the economics and even in the environment in completely abandoning agriculture in this area, and remember what I tell you, Tony, you know, I can assure you that the dream of every small producer is to stop being a small producer. Either leaving agriculture completely, there is no romanticism in that. Stop being a small farmer, or becoming a big farmer. And these are the trends you see today in the production systems in this region. Concentration in the production systems, and people being idle is not the answer to the observation that you make about the nature of today's world and today's economy. So then we have to backpedal a little bit and ask ourselves, you know, questions that include the fate of the human within the big plans imposed on us by economic systems that seem overpowering. That's my take on that.
Great. And we have a final question from Paddy.
Yes.
And then we, Robert.
A recent article in the BNAS shows, interestingly, how much of the virtual water that's exported by the United States come from overmined aquifers. It shows the percentage of this that comes to the MENA region. And there's a staggering volume of water that we're importing.
Egypt, of course, a lot of water.
So 30% of the cereals we import, the blue water footprint comes from overexploited aquifers in the United States. In your opinion, shall the MENA region look for in the future other sources of countries to import cereals from, like Russia, given this unsustainability of the aquifers?
Well, I'm not up to speed on the exact statistics, but the region is already importing significant water from what they call the Black Sea, from Ukraine and Russia. So the position in 1972 was that nothing would come from there. Now the biggest increase in grain trade imports is coming from that region. So yes, that's, a message from 20 years ago is if you're in a position that you depend on the global system for your food, you should think demography and where the other demand is coming from, and say, gee, China, extraordinary, a billion less people. China having a demographic policy. I'm not saying it's a good thing and so on, but it's extraordinary the outcome. An unintended outcome, I said, because the reason they did it was for other reasons of not having to build so many schools in too many cities. But that outcome is more important. And the other one that you need to be looking at is the other competitors in the global system. Because there's no escape from the Middle East with its demographics being on the world market for more. And therefore, we need to understand the global market. You can see that the number of places where food is coming from, in a sense, is rather simple and clear. So there are interesting determinants that were experimented, or let's say there was a big experiment in the 1970s, in the Kissinger years, when Saudi Arabia was suggesting that it could tread heavily on the world stage, and the Americans saying, no, you can't. So the food politics have never, that's the only time that food politics have been around. They weren't talked about very much at the time, but Eckhart, who we work with, obviously has written a whole book about that, indicating that there have been moments when the food and oil, so the mutual dependence was tested, and at that point, and I presume for the foreseeable future, the strength lies with the United States in that particular field. But you're right to say that there are red lights appearing in the American agricultural system. I mean, it's a phenomenal system to see how it works and how much food is now still coming out of California, which was dried up the Colorado and smashing the groundwater of California. But still the farmers who own the water in that particular legal system are determined to pump the water because they have this chance. So across the world we are experimenting with the water environment, mainly with groundwater, because groundwater can't look after itself. At least green water, in a sense, can look after itself. You can't use last year's because it's not there, or the year before's, or next year's, but with groundwater, even if you've got some storage, you can use that from 2 years ago, and then from 1 year ago, and then you can use next year's for the theatre. So blue water is extremely vulnerable to an unregulated management environment.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for all of you coming tonight to this lecture. Thanks to Tony Allan. Let's give him a round of applause.